Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. There are very few games that understand scale, spectacle, and set pieces the way the Uncharted series does. In fact, the more that I think about it, the more I realize that this series is in a league of its own when it comes to that. Uncharted 4 is now over a decade old, if you can believe it, but if you told me this game came out this year, I'd believe you. It still looks unbelievably good, constantly making me stop in my tracks just to take in the stunning views that Naughty Dog has created, massive landscapes, the collapsing structures, and all of the ridiculous action sequences all come together to create an adventure that feels more ambitious than honestly many of the games releasing today. But throughout my playthrough, I also started to realize that Uncharted 4 can definitely struggle at times. The pacing can shift jarringly, its level design can become predictable, but what's strange is that the game never really stopped being impressive. So I recently wrapped up my playthrough, and this video is going to be everything I have to say about Uncharted 4, from its presentation and set pieces to the combat, exploration, and everything in between. Now, I might as well start with the most obvious strength, because Uncharted 4 looks absolutely incredible, and that still might be an understatement. There were moments where I genuinely forgot I was playing something that was originally released back in 2016 because the environments look stunning, the lighting is very well done, the facial animations and cinematics, all of that still holds up better than honestly what we see in today's games. What impressed me the most was the way the game understands scale. Naughty Dog constantly gives the players something to compare against. For example, Nathan looks very tiny beside a giant mountain, and there's these entire pirate settlements and cities that sit below the player, while these landscapes stretch far into the distance. These moments were the ones I appreciated more, given just how many games I've played this year alone, and not a single game has pulled off scale in this manner. What I mean by this is that the game knows when to pull the camera back and let the view do the work for you. Sometimes the reward for reaching the top of a structure or a watchtower is simply seeing where you are and getting your bearings. Scotland has these huge cliffs overlooking the ocean, Madagascar is full of these open plains and distant mountains, and the islands are a huge contrast with the clear blue water, the beaches, and the ruins that dot the environment. I stopped moving just to take in some of the picturesque views more often in this game than any other game in recent memory. I think what ended up becoming the most impressive looking part of the game for me was after Drake crashed on the island after a shootout with Shoreline. This climb up that led to this view of the waterfall was absolutely stunning. There are so many moments just like this that often the reward of reaching whatever objective was secondary to taking in the beautiful landscape that I was rewarded with. Then of course there are the set pieces, which are obviously the part of Uncharted that almost everyone talks about and the series is well known for. In fact, I do plan on going through every Uncharted game eventually and ranking all the set pieces, so if that's something that interests you, maybe consider subscribing. With that being said, I honestly think the Madagascar chase scene in particular is one of the best action sequences I think I've played in any game. It begins with Nate moving through a crowded city while Shoreline starts to close in and then slowly builds into this huge chase involving trucks, motorcycles, armored vehicles, and of course the staple collapsing buildings. What makes the sequence work is that it constantly escalates in one way or another, and this is true from basically a lot of the set pieces and sequences that Uncharted 4 has. You're either driving, shooting, or jumping between vehicles using the grappling hook, and you're expected to react as the scene changes right in front of you. It can definitely feel orchestrated because obviously it is, but it doesn't feel like I am simply watching a movie play out. There's enough interaction to make me feel like I was actively participating. I only mention this because you'll often hear critics of the game talk about how it feels like you're watching a movie play out rather than actually playing a video game. In fact, it's a pretty common theme with PlayStation exclusives. Regardless, the Madagascar escape starts and ends with chaos, but that's par for the course. So it turns out that Nathan Drake has a habit of turning every vehicle he touches into scrap metal, but this video's partner, War Thunder, takes its vehicles a little bit more seriously. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and you can play it completely free on PC, consoles, and mobile. You can command more than 2,500 tanks, aircrafts, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations, covering everything from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to modern fighter jets and main battle tanks. Instead of giving every vehicle a simple health bar, War Thunder models individual components like the engine, fuel tanks, weapons, armor, and crew. The type of ammunition you use and exactly where your shot lands can completely change the outcome. The X-ray damage view is the feature I personally recommend checking out. It shows where a shell penetrated, which internal components were hit, and exactly what caused the vehicle to be destroyed. Combined with the detailed vehicle models, realistic graphics, and authentic sound design, the battles do a great job of making you feel like you're actually controlling these machines. War Thunder also has a worldwide community of more than 95 million players with massive PvP battles and a huge amount of content covering military vehicles from across history. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile using my links in the pinned comments or video description. New players and returning players who haven't played for at least 6 months can also receive a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles. It includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of a premium account. The offer is only available for a limited time, so make sure to claim it now. With that being said, let's get back to Nathan Drake and his ongoing chaotic adventure. The Madagascar sequence is not the only place where Uncharted 4 understands spectacle. There's the prison escape, the auction, the clock tower, the ship graveyard. Almost all of it is equally great. I can go on, but this video would last far too long. Now, of course, I have to give a quick shout out to the soundtrack because it does a lot to support the scale and emotion of the adventure. During the larger action sequences, the music really starts to build up alongside everything that is happening on screen, making an already chaotic chase feel a little bit more intense. The music also does pull back in the more quieter moments where you're exploring with Sam or Elena or Sully, and it gives those scenes a lot more of a reflective feeling without becoming overly dramatic. And then, of course, there's also a sense of familiarity with the main theme that immediately makes the game feel like an Uncharted game. That being said, the spectacle does start to lose a bit of its impact when the game starts to use its tricks too often. Every bridge in the game just happens to be unstable, and every handhold is just ready to snap and send Drake falling down hundreds of feet. Early on, these moments created tension because I didn't know what could happen, but near the end of the game, I could almost call the collapse before it started, and I'm sure a lot of players who have played this game can feel the same way. Now, Uncharted 4 is still a linear game just like its predecessors, but it gives players more freedom than I expected in some areas. The larger sections in Madagascar and around the islands are not open worlds, nor do they need to be, but they create enough space to make the adventure feel less restricted. You have a destination in the distance, but the game occasionally lets you decide how you want to reach it. Madagascar is probably the strongest example of this. Nathan, Sam, and Sully travel across a huge area in a jeep, following clues connected to Henry Avery while stopping at towers, ruins, and small points of interest along the way. You can take different routes across the terrain, drive towards something in the distance, or stop when a structure starts to catch your attention. Most of these detours reward you with like a collectible or maybe a journal entry or a smaller conversation between everybody. So there isn't really like a major progression incentive behind exploring, which is totally fine. The scenery was enough for me, but I also have to give a shout out to the wench mechanic. I'm not sure why I enjoyed using this thing so much, but here we are. The boat section sort of works in a similar way. Nathan and Sam are moving between these smaller islands, looking for the next clue while having conversations about their past and what the treasure means to them. The area is controlled, just like Madagascar, but it feels open because the player can choose where to land and which ruin to inspect first. There is that sense of discovery which an adventure game like Uncharted should inherently have, but the game still does a good job of just naturally guiding you to the same eventual objective. What I also liked about these sections is that they let the character relationships develop more naturally, because while I still have control of Nathan, Sam, Sully, and Elena are all talking to one another, and some of the best lore drops happen when nothing major is taking place. Details start to get filled in. We learn more about each character as well as the treasure that we're after. Now, of course, Uncharted 4 has a huge amount of climbing. And while the actual act of climbing is not particularly deep, it does feel fluid and responsive, which goes a very long way. You move toward the next highlighted surface, press in the direction Nathan needs to go, and basically watch some animation carry you across the environment. The Grabbable ledges are all very clearly marked, and I think only a few of them have yellow paint. Shout out to Star Wars Outlaws. What makes the climbing feel a little bit better was seeing Nate actually reach for a particular ledge, depending on which direction you're moving the left stick in, and it's those types of details that just help in creating a more immersive game. The grappling hook improves traversal quite a bit. Swinging across large gaps and building momentum feels awesome, especially when there's a slide connecting into that jump or a rope swing. Those sliding sections come up often, and I love them each time that they did. The piton adds another traversal tool later on, but the base climbing never changes much from its introduction. That's fine, but by the second half, I admittedly did start to feel a little bit of the repetition, where you're kind of climbing a wall, you're moving across a ledge, you're pushing a crate and then using that crate to reach another ledge, and things just begin to collapse around you while you're trying to continue upwards. The locations change, but the interactions stay mostly the same. Sometimes the game definitely stretches these sequences out longer than I felt like they needed to, but I guess it all just results into a longer runtime. Regardless, this is another area where the presentation does a lot of the heavy lifting. In a less attractive game, I think some of these climbing sections would feel incredibly tedious. In Uncharted 4, however, when I'm moving across the cliff, there's an entire coastline behind me, or I'm climbing through the remains of Libertalia while these waterfalls are cutting through the city. What I'm basically saying is, even when the mechanic itself gets repetitive, the environment that's surrounding this mechanic makes the journey worth seeing, and that's something that Naughty Dog clearly understood, and that's why even into the later runtime of the game, I was still enjoying what I was doing. That said, the exploration in general works because the world is interesting enough to see. The shooting mechanics in Uncharted 4 are pretty simple. Nathan can aim, take cover, switch weapons, there are some throwables like grenades, and then he can also do some melee when enemies get close enough. Now, there is no real progression system, and Nathan basically has these same abilities at the beginning of the game that he has at the end. That simplicity is not necessarily a problem because the actual combat is carried by the arenas that you fight in. Naughty Dog builds encounters with verticality, pieces of cover, tall grasses, side routes, climbable surfaces, and so much more. The player is basically given a tool set at their disposal, then they're dropped into spaces that allow them to use those tools to combine them into something that is really fun and can be quite creative. I always preferred starting encounters through stealth whenever I could. Nathan has the ability to mark enemies, he can hide in grass or just kind of climb around the perimeter. You sort of get that freedom to approach these combat arenas the way you want. Now, the stealth system itself is not especially complicated, but it gives you enough information to make a plan for approaching a section full of enemies. Like, I could identify a sniper, I can see some enemies' patrol routes, I can remove someone who's just standing alone, and slowly work my way to the end of the objective. Now, I was happy to see that the enemy AI had some really good awareness. Even on the normal difficulty I was playing on, I had to be really aware of their sight lines because there were numerous moments where I thought I was in the clear, only to be caught out mid-assassination and then going into a gunfight. I think usually I would take down 2 or 3 enemies before someone saw me, and the whole encounter would just turn into a massive shootout. While failing at stealth was annoying for me, and I would honestly often restart a mission if I did fail stealth just because I really wanted to complete a mission without being seen. When it did devolve to a gunfight, however, I was still happy about it because the combat in this game is at its best when you're not just sitting behind one piece of cover, even though that was something I admittedly had to relearn. Cover in this game is absolutely crucial. Nate isn't invincible, and it doesn't take too many bullets to bring him down. Constant movement in this game is key, since a lot of the time the cover you do use is only temporarily available, as enemy bullets will eventually shred whatever cover you thought was safe, which I thought was a really nice touch. Thankfully, Nate is extremely mobile. The arenas have several routes and grapple points that you can attack from, and the game gives you enough ammunition that is scattered around and the ability to constantly switch weapons. Shotguns are super useful when enemies start to close in. The rifles can handle most situations pretty well. Pistols always remain effective and are very useful if you're hanging from a ledge and trying to pick enemies off, and the explosives help deal damage to the armored soldiers that start to appear about midway and later into the game. Now, that being said, enemy variety is where the combat, in my opinion, starts to struggle. Shoreline soldiers make up most of what you fight. In fact, I think they're the only people you fight. And while there are different weapon types and levels of armors to them, their overall behavior doesn't change that much. Some enemies carry shotguns, some use sniper rifles, some will rush Nathan, but in the end, you're approaching every group in the same basic way. Now, pacing is probably the area where I had the most mixed feelings on the game, and this is gonna sound a little bit nitpicky, but hey, you know what? It is my video. Now, Uncharted 4 moves very well when it combines exploration, combat, and that character development all in one. When you're moving between these continuous set pieces and the dialogue picks up and things just happen dynamically. Then you get to a point where things can suddenly pull back and you're basically asked to walk slowly through a house while looking through old objects and basically trying to find something. The childhood sections are the most obvious and only example, I guess. And don't get me wrong, I understand why they exist. The game needs to establish Nate and Sam's relationship and show where their fascination with history came from. From a story perspective, those scenes matter a lot, and I enjoyed learning more about the two. But their placement can be a little bit jarring. Like the game opens up with Nathan and Sam speeding through a storm while being attacked by boats, then immediately cuts to them as children sneaking across the roof of an orphanage. Later, the game reaches another major turning point and slows down for a really long mansion sequence where the brothers explore their mother's past. These moments, of course, give the characters depth, but they also change the pace so sharply. I would be fully locked into a chase or a major discovery, then suddenly everything would stop. The other biggest issue is when the game's own strengths can start to feel like extra padding. The repeated destruction is a good example of something that the game excels in and then later turns on to extra time padding. A bridge will almost always collapse. Nate will almost always fall into a lower area where I need to climb back towards the path I was already on. And it looks and feels exciting, at least in the first half of the game. It was, but mechanically it had only extended the journey overall. Eventually, I started recognizing the moments where the game was creating a problem simply to make me spend more time solving it, if that makes sense. I don't think Uncharted 4 needed to be dramatically shorter at all. In fact, a lot of the Uncharted games in general are pretty short. I think the first Uncharted is only like 7 hours, the third one is similar in length, and Uncharted 4 along with Uncharted 2 are a little bit on the longer side, and I think the story benefits from having room to develop Nathan and his relationship with Elena and Sam, but I can imagine a version that trims some of the extra traversal areas and the repeated collapses without really losing anything important. Now, the story ended up being one of the strongest aspects of Uncharted 4, and honestly, it was far better than I had ever anticipated. The previous games had plenty of memorable characters and moments, but this one felt much more interested in slowing things down and exploring who Nathan Drake actually is outside of his treasure hunting obsession. Sam is also a great addition, although including a brother who had never been mentioned before could have easily felt like a forced thing. Somehow the game makes it work. His relationship with Nathan feels very natural, and you can understand why Nathan would be willing to risk everything to help save him. Sam is likable, but the game also makes it clear that his obsession with Avery's treasure is very destructive. He is not some straightforward villain. In fact, he's not even a villain to begin with, but he is responsible for dragging Nathan back into a lifestyle that he had basically left behind. Rafe is a solid antagonist for similar reasons. He's also not trying to destroy the world or control some supernatural power. He is simply obsessed with proving himself, especially once Nathan becomes involved. His frustration slowly builds throughout the game, and by the end of it, finding the treasure seems less important to him in comparison to beating Nate to it. The overall mystery surrounding Henry Avery and Libertalia is interesting enough to keep the adventure moving forward, but I would not say the treasure itself was the most compelling part of the story. It helped propel things, but what worked was how the history of the pirate colony essentially reflected the characters searching through it. The founders would go on to betray each other over the fortune, while Sam and Rafe slowly allow that same obsession to kind of take over them as well. The story does occasionally move slower than I would have liked, and some of the flashbacks, as I mentioned already, were pretty awkwardly placed, but the payoff is definitely worth it in the end. Uncharted 4 is an incredible game in so many different ways, but at the same time, it is definitely not a flawless one. The climbing and collapsing structures become repetitive, enemy variety is pretty weak overall, and the pacing can shift a bit too jarringly. There are moments that do feel padded, and I do think some of the journey could have been tightened. But the things that Uncharted 4 does well are still difficult for most games to even come close to. The presentation remains absolutely unbelievable. The vistas constantly sell a sense of scale, and the set pieces are among the best that the industry has ever produced. The combat is simple, but the arenas and stealth options and movement give the player enough freedom to create some genuinely amazing moments. So is Uncharted 4 really that good? Absolutely. Very few games understand cinematic action, environmental scale, and presentation at this level. This is essentially the peak of gaming. I thoroughly enjoyed my playthrough of Uncharted 4 and look forward to going back and playing all the other games once again. Again, thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. New players and returning players who haven't played for at least 6 months can receive a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles by using my links in the pinned comment or video description. And a big shout out to this channel's members and Final Save supporters. You guys are the backbone that help me keep going, and for that, I am very thankful. Thank you guys for watching this video. As always, I will see you all in the next one.